In our first video in this series, we shared a definition of the flipped classroom and looked at an example of the flipped classroom in practice. In this video, we're going to tackle some frequently asked questions about the flipped classroom. Question number one, does the flipped classroom work? Is there evidence that the flipped classroom works? Yes and no. I'm quite convinced by the study that we've mentioned elsewhere in this course by Freeman and colleagues that came out in 2014. It was a meta-analysis of other studies that compared active learning to traditional lecturing. In each study, there was some type of kind of control group, or at least quasi-control group model that was in place where learning outcomes could be measured in these two different conditions. And the results were pretty stark, actually. The failure rates in courses that were primarily lecture-based were around 34% on average. That is to say, a third of students failed those courses. In the active learning courses, on average, the failure rates were only 22%, which is a significant improvement. And when you looked at exam scores, comparing student learning, the active learning courses were on average 6 points higher. This is very compelling evidence that active learning works. Now, that's not quite the same as saying that the flipped classroom works, but to the degree that the flipped classroom is a vehicle or a mechanism for creating space inside class for active learning, I think this argues that, yeah, the flipped classroom does work. What's a little more challenging is that when instructors implement the flipped classroom for the first time and look for evidence of effectiveness, it doesn't always come through the first time out. Exam scores don't always improve. Students often feel like the flipped classroom helps them learn better, but they don't like it, right? Because it's asking them to kind of work through materials in different ways. And so often instructors kind of worry, okay, I tried it and the evidence is not very compelling. I think a lot of times it's implementation issues. And so typically the second or third time out when an instructor uses the flipped classroom, they start to see some improvement there. And it's really around those implementation issues where I think there's a lot of potential for teaching as research, for projects that explore various aspects or pieces of the flipped classroom framework and try to identify refinements that can be made so that it works better for particular courses, for particular groups of students. So for instance, I'll share a little study that I did some years ago looking at one aspect of the flipped classroom in my statistics course. I focused on those pre-class reading quizzes. So the questions that I asked students to work through as they were reading their textbook before class, were there particular types of questions that worked better or worse to help students make some sense of the material before class? So what I did is I assigned my students to different groups. Different groups got different types of questions. Some were more computational in nature. Some were more conceptual in nature. And then when they came to class, I gave them quizzes to kind of see how much they had gotten out of the pre-class material. And I compared their performance on the quiz on computational questions and conceptual questions. And the results were actually a little bit surprising. What you're looking at are in-class question types, and the bars represent the percentage of students who got those questions correct. Conceptual questions on one side, computational questions on the other side. The colors represent what type of pre-class questions the students received. So surprising to me, actually, the students who received computational pre-class questions as they were reading the material before class actually did better on the in-class quizzes in both computational and conceptual questions. And so my takeaway from this was, at least in this class, I had a whole bunch of engineering students. They're very concrete learners. They needed to work through some numerical examples, and that actually helped them get the concepts associated with it. And so it's this kind of study that I think has a lot of potential for you and your class to kind of explore different aspects of the flipped classroom and how to kind of, like I said, refine it in ways that are really tuned to your course and your students. Lots of opportunities here for you.